No.
Start. Do you have a mic?
I think we'll just switch.
Okay.
I'm actually afraid of the because I tend to I want to keep
People
myself
coming
like
in.
that.
Hello,
You know,
can you
that
hear me?
sound.
Hi, everyone.
I know. I want to be at their level with them. I'd rather have a.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel. It's great to see so many people here, and thank you so much for coming along. This panel is about the diversity dividend and how news organisations find success with underserved audiences. My name is Sarah Hartley. I'm a former journalist, and I'm currently the recipients manager for the Google News Initiative Innovation Challenge programme, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm also one of what we call the diversity champions, one of many, I have to say, within the organisation as well. Just to sort of give you a little bit of introduction about what we will do here today, I'm going to be moderating this session. You're going to hear from these three people here, experts in the field, who have a lot to tell you about this morning. Francois, Megan Lucero, and Dina Aboughazala, and of course, all of you, I hope. I really would like this not to be one of those panels which is just us speaking from up here behind the red table. So we will open for questions as soon as possible. I'm going to give like a sort of 5-minute intro to sort of set the context of what we're talking about. Then I'm going to invite the panelists here to basically do the same. But then we'd like to open to questions, so please get ready with your questions. Apparently, because of the live streaming, when you ask a question, it has to be kept relatively short, and I will have to repeat it back in order to record it. Okay, so just when we get to that part of the thing, that's how it's going to work. I'm going to use notes, so I might not be looking at you all the time. Just a little bit nervous, a little bit intimidated by this great crowd here. I know so many of you here, and thank you so much for your support. So before I hand over to the panelists, to set a little bit of context, it's probably worth just saying what we're talking about here with diversity. It's obviously a sensitive topic, and one which typically looks at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, caste, religion, disabilities. You've heard these definitions before, but actually it doesn't stop there. There are so many intersectionalities of this that we hope to be able to draw out a little bit of that today. In all our roles in the news ecosystem, we're often looking at how to be inclusive, whether that's in the newsroom, the boardroom, for our communities, our audiences, our sources, in the supply chain. There's a whole series of areas where diversity matters. And what we're going to discuss today is whether that diversity has its own reward or a dividend. The dividend we're talking about here today is often not simply cash on the bottom line, although this is, of course, important, but also other benefits that could be to the organisation, it could be to society at large, or it could be to the audience that we serve. I was struck by the report brought out by the World Economic Forum last month, which carried out a benchmarking study of media and entertainment. They found that, of course, there's still a lot of work to be done, which we all know, but that diversity, or DEI, as we often abbreviate it to, is not just the right thing to do, but actually is also good for business. And in these times when trust in journalism is so important, their research found that a 10-point increase in their audience representation index they created was linked to a 30% boost in how likely consumers are to trust a brand. And it's not just research papers that can point to evidence of this good business. I've got a few examples I'd like to share briefly of people I've been working with in the North America Innovation Challenge that have been addressing this issue. I'll just briefly talk about those before we move on to the panelists. First of all, a startup you may not be so familiar with called Overture Global in New York, and they've created a freelance matching platform called HumanWorks. And okay, freelance matching platforms probably, there's not much new, you think, in that. They've been around for a while. But this one's different. It actually looks at new opportunities for freelancers that are from marginalized communities. And then it's worked out a way that they can take what they call a pay-forward business model, which takes between 5 and 20% of the revenue and distributes it across all local charities and NGOs that they work with. And then perhaps a name that you'd be a bit more familiar with, Vox Media. They produce consumer brands like the New York Magazine and The Verge. And they are creating a DEI, a diversity-related style book or guide for newsrooms called Language Please. They found that this guide is all about really the tough conversations that they can have, and it's one of the most useful tools they could make. And they're about to launch a website which will be freely available to other newsrooms. And finally, Grey TV, a company that operates television stations in 113 markets in the US. They wanted to do some work which looked at health divisions, and they looked at underrepresented communities in Appalachia and Mississippi. Not only did their work on what's resulted in a documentary called The Great Health Divide, if you want to look that up, it's very powerful. Not just great content, but they also found that the experience really helped out internally, gave their investigative team more visibility, and it really opened their colleagues' eyes to the importance of addressing in this issue with data and data-driven impactful journalism. So while they're all great examples of different news organizations approaching this issue, I think they also both illustrate a need and some new urgency to tackle this issue. And with that, I'm going to hand over the baton to our three panelists, and we're going to start with Francois, who's going to give us some global perspective from his work.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks, Megan and Dina, for joining on this panel. So, just by way of introduction, my name is Francois. I'm a reader, associate professor in media innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Central Lancashire. Is this not? Okay, is that better? Push. There we go. That's better. Okay, let's try again. It's like the version of you're on mute. Okay. So I'm Francois. I'm an associate professor in media innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Central Lancashire in northwest of England, Preston. And as you can hear, if you're familiar with British accents, I'm probably not from there. And I make up part of the 9.6 million foreign-born British people, which is, for those of you who know British society, there's a huge foreign-born constituent. I'm interested in this topic, which is one of my passions, for two reasons. I run the Journalism Innovation and Leadership Program, a part-time postgraduate program for executives, that has as its focus fostering the next generation of diverse newsroom leaders and innovators our industry needs. And our proposition is, if we need a different kind of industry, we need different kind of people as well in positions of power. I'm also, another thing I do is I'm a co-editor and the founder of the World Association of Newspapers, when IFRA's World News Publishers Outlook study that's been going, and we've been asking questions about that, because one of the things we know, if you want to manage any issue, you need to, and if it matters, you need to start collecting some numbers about that in order to manage those things. So that's the perspective I'm coming from, is from both those two activities that I'm involved in. The only thing I'd like to add, because I'd like to hand over the the microphone very soon, but I think we should just step back before we plunge into this topic. And just to clarify a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about diversity and dividends. Dividends, of course, as Sarah stated, is the distributed profits to corporate shareholders. So when we're talking about dividends, we're talking a payoff. And a payoff to shareholders is the word for dividends. And so the payoff we're talking about today is not the payoff to the company, it's the payoff to the people who are invested in our activities. There's plenty of ways that diversity can pay off to people and with very negative results. When we're talking about diversity within the media, of course, we're talking about pretty much three things: people, products, and purpose or profits, if that's what you're thinking about. And when we're talking about people, we're talking about who's doing it, who they're doing it for, who's being represented in the room. And the workforce diversity is one issue, the sources is one issue, and the audience is other kinds of issues. Of course, products, we're talking about a great deal within our industries about diverse products, and there's sometimes an intersection there where the people you're doing it for might be younger people as a demographic group, and therefore you choose different kind of products. We're doing this on Instagram or something else. So there's a lot of conversations about matching people and product right now. Then I think in this conversation, it's the point about the profit, but the what's it for and why we're doing it is, of course, a range of different things. Some of it in the short term might be money. So I've been trying to make the case within my work with WAN IFRA and the Outlook report to see, is there a relationship between the profits of media companies and the extent to which they invest in diversity? So that's one of the questions. But of course, the broader question is, when you look at the word diversity, its Latin origin is to divert, diverso. And when we think of that, it's ultimately, this conversation is about diverting power from some groups to other groups, distributing, changing power, diverting, to divert things. And I think that's where we really need to talk about. What do we mean when what's the point of all of this diversity activity? And do we sometimes, what I am very concerned about when I'm on these, when we have these conversations, is that we get stuck by thinking the point of the activity is diversity, is division. The point of diversity activities is not division. It's peace. It's unity. In the end, we don't want society to be broken apart by lots of diverse voices shouting across the rooms at each other. We want people to come together and to have some kind of common understanding. So I'm really interested in handing over to Megan and Dina to talk more about how they tackle that challenge.
Is that on? Can you hear me all right? Yes, that's working. Okay, thank you so much, Francois. So for the sake of introductions, my name is Dina, and I'm from Egypt. And this session's title is How News Organizations Find Success with Underserved Audiences. So I can tell you how we built our business based on diversity, and I will leave to you the decision whether we're successful or not. So I used to work for the BBC for 14 years, between 2006 and 2020. In August 2020, I decided to leave the BBC and launch a startup called Egab. What we do is that we empower local journalists from across the Middle East and Africa, i.e. sub-Saharan Africa, because people always put us in this MENA region thing, and to get published in international media outlets, and we specialize in solutions journalism. So, how did we build that business on diversity? Really, the answer is very easy if you understand how to build a business. Because the first thing anyone would tell you if you go to any business incubator or an accelerator, etc., is that you have to start with the problem. And there's this very, very famous motto, you fall in love with the problem, not the solution, which is interestingly quite the opposite of what we do in the media. Because we usually say, oh, we will do this lovely podcast, or I'll launch this website, and then we start thinking of, okay, who is it for? And who would be interested in the content of this podcast? And I have decided to launch. Actually, in business, it starts the other way around. It's that first you have to see what is the problem that you want to solve, and who are you solving it for? And this is how it becomes very easy. You already have your mission and you have your audience. This is exactly what we did. So the problem we're solving is that you have, across the Middle East and Africa, you have every year thousands of journalism graduates who graduate every year and they can't find jobs. And and even if they found a job, the media scene, I'm here speaking in general, there are always exceptions, okay? So in general, the media scene in our part of the world is quite poor. So they end up actually either, the good ones either give up completely on the media industry because they just feel that's not what I signed up for, or they just continue to be part of this cycle of poor quality news. And then also, there's a problem with that they get paid really poorly. So again, they have to search for other jobs because journalism does not pay. And also there is another layer that actually even, it's very important as well, that in the first place, they don't get high quality education as well. So most people, when they graduate, they don't even know the basics of fact checking, even how to write a pitch. And this is real stories. I have journalists I deal with, like all of them, and they don't understand what is a pitch. When you say write a pitch, what is that even? So this is a big problem. That's how can you expect these journalists to be able to join international, media outlets without investing in them and giving them this very basic rights. And that's on the other side, the media outlets, as we all know, have, with the decline of ads revenue, etc., and all this trend for the subscription model and trying to find, other revenue streams. The problem is that you really need to stand out of the crowd, right? Like how many media outlets would you subscribe to? 1, 2? I'm a journalist. I'm only subscribed to 1. Seriously. So if you, among all these dozens and dozens of media outlets, you really need to stand up with the crowd. And how would you do that if you keep repeating everything that's on the wires? So that we're solving this for you as well. So if you take stories from local journalists who are on the ground and who can tell you interesting things that are happening in the communities because they have access to this, they're locals. At the same time, it's much more cost efficient because you don't have to fly reporters, you don't have to hire a fixer. We have a very strong stance against fixers. Anyway, so a fixer of pay for accommodation and etc. So it's a sort of a win-win situation, and at the same time, everyone's happy, and we will act. We're in the middle. We act as an enabler for the local journalists. So we lend them our power. That's why I started by saying my background working for the BBC, because yes, this is when we first started. We started in August 2020. That's why editors took us seriously, because I said, oh, I've worked in one of the top media brands, and I have with me my colleague Dalia, who joined me a year later, who was also ex-Wall Street Journal, ex-Bloomberg, ex-Al Jazeera English. So we know what we're doing, and that's how, that makes them respect us. But this is how we're modeled. We lend our power to the local journalists, so we empower them so that after a while they can, they can go on their own and do their own thing. And at the same time, the media outlets are getting access to all these original stories, without having to worry, because one of the things we discovered when we spoke to them is so there were two main arguments. So one of them is, but because of objectivity and etc. And we don't want to go there, because this objectivity argument of we need a British, for example, to cover Egypt so that they don't have a stake in whatever is going on, only applies when it's Egypt, because you know what, when Brexit was happening, and I was in London at the time, no one said, oh, let's bring this Egyptian to cover Brexit, so we make sure she gives us a very objective and impartial view. So that was like an argument that we didn't take seriously. That's just a colonial legacy thing. But the other argument they gave us, and we thought, okay, there's something here, is that the quality. They said, well, we have a real problem with the quality of journalism we get from local reporters. Yes, and it's a fair thing, but this is the point. How can you expect people to give you high quality reporting if they have not been trained or educated for this? So this has been our model, and this is how we built it on diversity. I don't want to say everything before the time. Thank you. So now it's Megan's turn.
First off, I feel like I just came across Dina in the past couple of weeks, and I'm just completely inspired by that. And I also love when you meet someone when you realize so much of your worlds are aligning. So a lot of what we do is a very kind of synergistic approach to this when you think about it from inside a single country, and how you think about local journalists and how you think about on-the-ground community reporting. So as was sort of mentioned earlier, I am the director of the People's Newsroom at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism based in the UK. I also headed up and ran the Bureau Local within the Bureau for the past 5 years. And just to kind of give you the kind of quick overview of this, in some ways I feel like an outlier on this panel, because when we talk about success for our businesses, we are a nonprofit. When we think about our metric, we're not thinking about shareholder profit. We're thinking our ultimate goal is to better the lives of our communities, to make sure that people have more thriving and happy and democratic lives, right? This is what we are ultimately aiming for. We're an impact-driven organization. We believe that journalism should spark change in the world, and we're unabashed by that. That is our aim. So when you start from that place of that is success. Success is when our communities thrive. Success is when we are represented. That's the kind of place that we're starting from. And I'm going to tell you a bit of a kind of journey on how we got there. I was hesitant to come on this panel, completely honest, because I've been on diversity panels for 10 years now. I used to work for the Times and Sunday Times in London before this. As you can imagine, I was one of the few women in that newsroom at the time. I was one of the few kind of queer women in that space. I was on diversity panels for such a long time talking about what's one thing you can do to like slightly change this world. And I just was sick of it. So what I want to share really are kind of practical, real understanding about how we are shifting that. And what I love about this is being able to see it in practice, being able to hear from Dina, and hopefully be able to share a bit myself of kind of how we actually build this in from the beginning. These are not add-on ideas. These are, as was sort of mentioned, is like holistically, this is an entire approach to actually representing. The ultimate goal I kind of see in journalism as sort of saying is doing that. So coming up from that perspective, Bureau Local, to kind of give you that overview, we're a nonprofit newsroom, classic, what you would probably imagine, classic investigative nonprofit newsroom. But what we have done over the years with Bureau Local is to really, really break that down, break apart the notion of a kind of elite idea of investigative journalism and open that up. So what Bureau Local is a grassroots, people-powered investigative network. Our aim is to co-create, collaborate, shift power, and ensure that everyday people and everyday people that are experiencing issues are creating the investigations and are part of those investigations. So, after this panel, I'll share a few links of stories that we've done. We've co-created and co-designed a process with delivery riders, so gig economy app riders, in I guess the kind of equivalent of sort of Uber Eats or some sort of other food delivery app. In the UK, there's a thing called Deliveroo. We opened up a call, we asked people to tell us what issues they're facing. Delivery riders came forward to us and said, we don't understand our pay, we don't understand the algorithm behind how this works. We paid this group, not as sources, we paid them as experts and trained them in investigative techniques, and together we co-created and investigated that issue with them, for them, and by them. During COVID, we asked people, what are the most important things that you need to know about? And it wasn't just health, it was also their jobs. This is what led to this Deliveroo investigation. But crucially, we also began to find out that while everybody was talking about vaccines, there were so many people who had no access to that. We were hearing from community groups that undocumented people were not getting access to the vaccines. So we, again, co-created, worked closely with community organizing groups, and did a piece on migrants' access to the vaccine. This was actually one of our most high-impact investigations last year, because it led to the end of it, the government actually producing the guidance on how undocumented people can access the vaccine. They actually published it in multiple languages. Surprisingly, this was not available before, and even when migrants were trying to go to GP surgeries and get that, they were still being kind of turned away, leading the government to actually producing a letter that they could print out and kind of bring into that. For us, that is when we talk about sort of success. We're talking about people were vaccinated because this story came out, because we worked with an issue that they deeply understood. So for us, and this might feel to you kind of unrelated to diversity, but I think for us, this is about marginalized communities. These are about people who are not represented often in our newsrooms, whose stories aren't often being told. And for us, it's building that kind of in from the very, very beginning. So when we think about diversity, we think about belonging. That is our real kind of overarching strategy that we think about it at our organization. And that might feel really soft, especially in a panel when you're talking about sort of dividends and business, but it is absolutely crucial. We want to think about how do people belong to our newsroom? So as we mentioned before, who are the people in the newsroom making the decisions, making the calls? How do we make sure that we are bringing the right kind of people into that newsroom, and how do they stay, and how do they belong in that space? We want to make sure that our stories are ones of belonging for people reading it. So many times when we hear from people in communities that we work with, they turn on the news, they open a newspaper, and they are filled with dread that journalism is the problem and not the solution for their lives. They are seeing the way that Muslim communities are reported in Britain. They're seeing the way that transphobic tropes are being brought into and weaponized against communities in the press. And this is, for me personally, kind of not acceptable, but we think about how can you actually build journalism and create stories that people feel a sigh of relief. They see themselves, they see their communities reflected, they see opportunities for that to happen. Our ultimate aim when we think about journalism is that it's a useful tool in the world. We talk about our journalism lifting off the page and going out into the world and genuinely being useful, that this information is now actually being used, that they can act on it, they can do something about it, that it can change kind of people's lives. So this is really, really crucial. And the final thing that we think about, so it's not just belonging in a newsroom, not just the product of that newsroom and being kind of a place of belonging, but that the ecosystem itself also needs to be belonging. We can't be doing this in isolation. This is a kind of collective, definitely a collective point. So briefly I think it's important to talk about how we get there, because I think sometimes you hear these stories and you think, that's really lovely for this organization over there, that can't kind of happen for us. This takes time. It means showing up every single day. It means thinking, how can I begin to kind of make those changes? And I mentioned this because, as I said at the beginning, I have been in spaces where this wasn't talked about, but here are the kind of key steps I just thought would be useful to kind of come through. We've made a commitment a few years ago now to decolonize the news. This is an initiative that we launched and we've built kind of people around. And as part of that, we commit as an organization to be transparent about the steps we're taking in the hope that it inspires other people. I'll share that link as well because we have our kind of public statements on that. And again, I hope people use that, and I hope they go away and share it with their own newsrooms and say, what are things that we can kind of do? And also, please join the coalition if that's important to you. But just very briefly so you understand, we think about it from the very top to the very bottom. So we're taking steps to diversify our board. We are reimagining and recreating our recruitment process. We have launched a paid, which is very important in this space, paid internship, paid fellowship programs that center marginalized communities to come through that form of journalism. Inside our newsroom, we've created a committee of staff members that actually have power to hold our senior management accountable to our commitments to DEI. We partner with organizations and groups to share our knowledge, our specific world of investigative journalism. So we partnered with an organization like We Are Black Journos, and we've also done pieces of work with the trans and non-binary community to do trainings on investigative journalism, sharing our knowledge, kind of sharing our power to kind of bring that through. As I mentioned, we make these sort of public commitments, and we're continuing to do a lot of kind of work in that space. But then, as you say, the real hard stuff now comes in. In some ways, all that work has been happening over years, and we are not perfect. We are far from getting there, but these kind of steps are just the beginning. But in a lot of ways, the real hard work is building it into the product, as we talked about, actually getting to that place where I mentioned of making sure our stories are kind of shared and co-created with the very people that you want to be consuming that work. But the way that we set out to do that is we launched an initiative called Change the Story, and we invited people all across the country to form an advisory group to help us advise what is the mandate for the future of our project. This led to a manifesto for a people's newsroom, and it's largely people imagining the world of journalism they want, and we use that as our kind of guiding force for how Bureau Local runs our work. We've also begun a source audit, so we're auditing who's in our sources, who are our sources in our stories, and how we can kind of really understand and reflect that. We often talk about in our own, as journalists, we hold organizations and public institutions accountable by saying, if you don't record it, how are you going to change it? So we're doing that ourselves. We're auditing every piece that we published last year, and we're looking at all kinds of demographic and information about how we're going to understand our current state, where our gaps are, what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, so that we can start to make goals to kind of change that going forward. And then crucially, as I say, we keep doing this work in Bureau Local about shifting that kind of power, making sure there are different people in this space. And then finally, we've launched the People's Newsroom, which I mentioned at the very beginning. This is our next stage about our next kind of moment of thinking about how we shift power and share resources. So not just making sure that the stories are grassroots, but actually that media organizations themselves can be grassroots, that people from all across the country can start their own newsrooms, and that marginalized communities can own the newsrooms in which they tell their own stories. So we are beginning to think about an infrastructure project that we launched within that. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview, and I appreciate that was a bit of a list, but I personally love to have tangible understandings of how those kind of steps happen, so I hope that's useful.
That's great, thank you to all of you. A lot to go at there, I think. I hope you're all getting your questions ready, but I'm going to just kick things off by asking a couple of questions and then come to you to take over. Measuring things has been mentioned by all of you. You know, you've been looking at your board, you've been looking at different measures, and I think impact is something that's really difficult to assess in this area. I know I think about impact quite a lot. So I was wondering, how do you go about that, each of you? How do you look at the question of measurement and impact when you're considering diversity? I mean, is it simply quota counting? Hopefully not. Or, you know, how do you actually approach that? How do you find that balance?
So I think whenever we look at performance, or which is what is our performance measure, We do sometimes look at financial measures. What are the performance measures or audience measures, or some of those hard numbers in terms of that? I think the next bit is, what's the purpose of your organization? And Megan was talking about that. So what is the impact on society? And there are ways to measure that, whether it's your story has an impact on policy or something. When I do studies around this, because I do quite a bit, we also ask questions about personal success measures. So to what extent do the people feel that the activities that they're involved with are successful? So I think those are the three kind of levels in which we measure the impact. But I think the major point is that you do need to clarify what your success measures are. And first, so it's a kind of ABC for me. Acknowledge that you need what those success measures are. The next one in terms of B is build some evidence about that. Count it or measure it or find a way to build evidence, collect evidence around that. Because it might be just one policy change as opposed to 100 people reading it, or 1,000 or 1,000,000 people reading something. It might be different. So build your evidence and then communicate that and collaborate with other people in that space. So that's the ABC for me.
That's great. Dina, do you go through that type of process? I mean, it might not be the same, but do you go through that type of thinking as you come to this?
Of course. I mean, again, it goes back to good business practice. So any good business should have a list of KPIs, key performance indicators. And it's really becomes very easy to set your KPIs if your mission is clear. And again, if your problem is clear and your audience is clear, then it's not that difficult. Because yes, I know always you mentioned how impact is always a problem, and I think it's only a problem if you're not clear about your mission. And also there's nothing as this one size fits all when it comes to impact, because it differs from one organization to the other based on the mission of the organization. So for our mission, because as I said, our mission is to empower journalists to get published in international media, and so we act as a middle person between the local journalists and the international media. So we have 5 basic KPIs at the moment, and then we have 2 extra that we've only introduced them this year, because the first year was all about proving the concept, because at the end of the day also it's all about execution. So you might have this greatest idea and all these research, but then when you execute it, you fail. So our 5 basic KPIs is first, the number of journalists, right? Because we want to serve local journalists, so we have to keep, are we really serving more journalists, or are we just serving 5 or 10 or 100 or thousands? And then the other thing is the range of cities and countries, because we want to make sure that we are, as I said, we're starting with the Middle East and Africa, but our ambition is to be able to cover all non-Western countries. But to be able to do that, we need to hire people, which we don't have the funding for at the moment. But the range of countries, are we covering more countries, and is these indicators growing? And also not just countries, cities inside the country. So for example, Egypt gets reduced to Cairo. Example, like if England gets reduced to London, it's not just London, it's the same. So we have in our network people from Asyut, Minya, and Upper Egypt, which is the very poorest areas of Egypt. So this is the second thing. The third thing is the number of media outlets, because there is another element to our model, is the media outlets. The number, are we dealing with a growing number of media outlets, and also the size of media outlets that we're dealing with, because we want also to be providing our services to as many media outlets in different countries as we can. And of course, the fourth thing is the number of stories. Is it working? That's great. We're having journalists, we're having countries, but are we delivering our promise of actually helping these young journalists be able to get published in international media outlets? Are we selling this? Just an indication. So in the first 3 months of 2022, we were able to sell as many stories as we sold in the entire 2021, just gives you an example of the growth. And the fifth, because at the end of the day, I'm a journalist. So yes, I'm a media entrepreneur now, but at heart, I'm a journalist. So it's the quality of the stories. Are we producing good stories? And I have to say, that's the indicator that's been a bit challenging for us because it requires cooperation of the media outlet. The media outlet feels okay to share with us their analytics, whatever it is. Some are fine with that, and it's great. Others are very protective of their data for some reasons. Others also take the stories and sometimes not promote it, and we're like, oh, why aren't you promoting the story? But the fact that all media outlets so far we've been dealing with come back to us is an indication. And also, we just, a couple of days ago, one story was on the long list of the One World Media Awards, and one of our journalists was in the International Journalist category. She's from Libya, no one heard of her before. She's the same list with Beltrou, and others from the LA Times. And I know awards is not always a good indication, but for us, it shows us that we're on the right track. There are two other indicators that we added this year, and that's, are we seeing progress in the quality of journalism being done by our journalists? Because our vision is to act just to be a launch pad to journalists. So we don't want them to stay with us forever. We don't want to own them. We want just to prepare them, like work with us for a year or two until you feel you're ready, you've had enough bylines, you've had enough skills, and then off you go on your own. So are we seeing that our journalists are progressing, the quality of pitches they're sending, the quality of the journalism? And the last one, are we helping, because we want to empower them, are we helping them, land better jobs? This is something that we were planning on the medium term, longer term, because our vision is that we would love to see, our vision that in the long term, what we really want to do is to be able to say that we are contributing to the generation of a new generation of local journalists, high-quality local journalists who can produce, high-quality journalism that on par with the ones that being published in international media. So are we opening, and then they can land jobs, perhaps international media outlets, or perhaps, even better, go ahead and launch their own media ventures, and thus elevating the quality of local journalism. And although, personally, I've said that I will start seeing this maybe 3 years down the road or 5 years, we've already seen signs of this. So few of our journalists have been receiving job offers based on, not like in full-time employment, but at least contract-based employment based on the stories they've done for us. So again, the journalist in Libya got contacted by the Red Cross, another in Yemen got contacted by an NGO related to education on the back of a story he did on education. So yes, so I think, again, it all goes back to what is your mission, what's the problem you're solving, and for whom, and then it's all very easy to measure from here. Thank you.
Megan, same question to you. What
I love all that. Oh, it's all just very easy from here when we all know how much work would have gone into doing all of that. It's just the people who do that work, it's very easy in the end to say that, isn't it? But I just want to acknowledge that. So yeah, obviously for us, it's very difficult. How do you measure that you're bettering the lives of people? Like that bit is incredibly difficult. But to be totally honest with you, for us, it's the process. It's not about the outcomes. And I know this might seem a bit kind of odd in this space, but ultimately at the end of the day, for us, journalism is about facilitation. It's not about gatekeeping, right? So that's everything I talked about before, about how we design the work that we do. It's not about saying we know what the story is and we know what the outcomes should be. It's about saying we are simply the facilitators for which people's stories need to be told. I think journalists need to get out of their own way and really reimagine and reconnect that element with communities. But in saying that, what I mean is that we often we're thinking about success. You don't know the outcome. You don't know the impact your story is going to have. And in some ways, it's kind of a fool's errand to sort of think that you will know it. But it's about the stages that we go through in the process that we get to there. At the beginning of investigations, we kind of have an impact planning to really think about what is the most kind of crucial time to tell this story? How can we make sure we kind of think about 3 stages of it, right? So people that are affected by an issue, people who are knowledgeable and who are deeply embedded in an issue, and people who can change an issue, right? So we think about how our story is our stories are working with or getting to each of those kind of people. So when we kind of think about ourselves, how do we make sure these pieces sort of come through? How do these elements kind of make it towards the end? But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just, is journalism providing value? It is actually being useful. So I gave you 2 stories earlier, right? This Deliveroo app story and the undocumented access to vaccines, right? The Deliveroo story was, for us, we transformed the way that we shared power. We worked with, built trust, and actually co-created an opportunity so that these writers had their own transparency about their pay, came together to tell their own story, and were able to see that hit a national agenda and mobilize their issue to at a very different level. Unfortunately, like at the time, it changed, it sparked a huge national agenda. There was very kind of controversial elements of the stock price dropping for this. There was protests and strikes amongst writers. It was what you would imagine at the time highly impactful. But as you can imagine, over time, the company has since become less transparent about pay and in an attempt to kind of move around it. And this happens. This happens in the state of working towards greater transparency or around an issue. A single story isn't always going to change and make it better. But at the end of the day, the writers said they had this power. They saw the power of journalism, and it was useful in this kind of moment. This kind of comes back to what Francois was saying, which is let your audience or let your community tell you if the journalism is useful. You can't measure the impact of that single story. Whereas the other example I mentioned, people were vaccinated as a result of that story. That is something that you kind of see and is kind of very tangible. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't immediately. But the truth is, as we know, change doesn't happen overnight. But what can happen is how we show up every day and how people find the act of journalism valuable, the way we do that, and that builds value for both your product, your organization, but ultimately what we're trying to do with journalism in the end.
Thank you. And I see we have a first question. You caught my eye there. I'm going to have to repeat the question after you ask it. So.
My name is I'm from Zetland in Copenhagen, Denmark. First of all, thank you for inspiring presentation. I was thinking about products, and you were beginning to coming with examples. What would be the best examples of journalism that you have done or seen other people do that you can say afterwards, this really made a change, this was really useful?
Okay, so the question is, thinking about product in this diversity space, what's the best example of a piece of journalism or a journalism outfit perhaps that you think typifies this? Start with you, Francois.
Oh, dear. Well, I think that's actually really interesting. What's the best example? I think the best example I've heard in the last 24 hours, besides our group here, which I think are very inspiring, is World Media, perhaps, which is, there we go, which I think is a very innovative and new way of connecting with people, and I found really interesting.
In what way is it different, just for those of us that don't know about it?
Okay, so what was very interesting is that at the heart of that was the notion that expertise and audience is about connecting expertise with audiences in new ways, in new products. They publish on social media first, but they don't hire necessarily journalists. They hire people who are experts and passionate about particular topics, and then connect those people with audiences who are inspired and motivated by those in a conversational way. And I think that is that's an amazing example right now.
Thank you.
Can I give an example from Egypt? So, and I think that's important because it's the importance of the cultural context. So we have this hit show at YouTube. It started on YouTube, actually, called The Dahih, which translates into the nerd. What he does is he tackles science, which is, who wants to read about science or watch about science, in a very funny way, in In Egypt, we're famous for being the Hollywood of the Middle East, or at least this is how we like to think of ourselves. And also, we're famous for being comedians. So yes, he does it in a very funny comedy way. And yes, he has millions of views, and he managed to do that because he understands his audience, and he understood the problem. People are not consuming science, right? There's a gap in the market, but the audience he's talking to, Egyptians, really like to have a good laugh. So how can I give them a very, give them informative content in a way that's also entertaining? So I think that's a very good example.
I ask this question actually a lot to people because I genuinely want to know what people think is useful, and it is really hard. I ask friends and non-journalists, what's the most, what's a useful or an impactful piece of journalism, and people can't give me one, and that is a real problem and a real crisis of our industry. When I think about it, I suppose in the UK The Guardian did a series of reports on the Windrush scandal, which you kind of might be familiar with, and this was a piece about this wasn't a single piece, that's actually the point of it. It was a series of stories that really talked about the Windrush generation, which came from the Caribbean into the UK, was brought to the UK, and yet these people over years experienced not just huge forms of racism, not just huge elements of discrimination, but were actually being kind of actively deported despite having the right to live in the UK. This was happening at scale. That community knew about it, but it only became in the consciousness of once actually one by one these stories were being told, and it wasn't able to stop every sort of deportation, but actually it was a huge element of policy reckoning and change in the UK. But I think more importantly, coming back to kind of what I said earlier, actually, a single story is often not what people think about if they think about value. It's about what that whole organization gives to that community. So if you hadn't had a chance to check out Outlier Media, I was on a panel with them yesterday, and Candice is here at the festival, but they provide like real direct civic need. My favorite quote from her yesterday was that 2,000 words is not going to save anybody in a crisis. When you need information during a storm, when you need to figure out how you're going to pay your rent or where you're going to kind of get your housing benefit, 2,000 words and a beautiful piece that scrolls is not going to save your life. That's not designed for what civic kind of real needs are. And they have SMS services. They just directly are serving their community every day, all the time, answering people's questions, genuinely being an information service to them. So I think for them, I can't speak for her, but what I see that organization that is useful, impactful, every day, and people think about that organization not for a single story that they do, but they think about in that community journalism and that organization as a useful and impactful resource and a thing that they belong to and a thing that they kind of serve. So I think, I for a long time always kind of would think about a single, because coming from an investigative place, a single investigation or a single piece. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, actually that process part we talked about and that real collective idea of an organization is really what we want to get to.
Did we answer your question?
Yes.
Good.
10 more to follow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi.
Please.
As someone who's also been on lots of panels and hasn't seen a lot change, I get, and this is a kind of a question really about the wider industry, I get concerned when we have to make a business case for diversity, because what that says to me is that the industry does not accept the argument that people are fundamentally equal and have equal value. We only care about it if we can monetize it. So why should people trust an industry that doesn't fundamentally believe people have equal value?
Sorry, could you just repeat the very end bit? Why should people trust an industry?
Why should people trust an industry that doesn't fundamentally believe people have equal value?
Okay, so the question is, why should people trust an industry that doesn't fundamentally believe in kind of the values of diversity? Yeah, okay. So it's quite a provocative question because you're taking the assumption that the industry doesn't believe, so let's start there.
Can I say something?
You can.
People don't trust it. That's the whole point of this, and that's why we, the ones who believe in the importance of media, want to push the industry to be more diverse so we can be reflective of the whole communities that we serve, because already research is telling us when people don't feel represented in the media, they don't trust the media, they don't engage with it, they don't. So the status of the play of the moment is that we have a trust issue.
I think we do have a trust issue, but I think, Shirjan, it's great. I think generalizations like what you've just done is dangerous, because you are saying an entire media industry, which includes the people here, should not be trusted. I think we need to break that down quite a bit, and when we talk about that, there are highly trusted media, and there are also media that aren't trusted. And who are they trusted by? Which constituents do they serve? I think we need to ask ourselves a couple of those questions before we make these sweeping statements.
I'd like to jump in, which is, I think it's really, really important to not be defensive about this kind of question. And it's really important that that onus is not being put back on people in a way that's saying that that's dangerous. Because to be totally honest, that question is the question outside this room that people on the street have. That's a real thing. We can't talk to ourselves and talk to the industry about this. In real life, like, that question comes from a place of real experience. People, and I said to you, I know this because I work with so many groups, as I said at the beginning, that do not trust news because it is that. And when it starts from a place of, I only want to diversify, if you only want to diversify for commercial reasons, that will show up. That will be seen, and you won't be trusted for it. To be totally honest, that won't happen. So I think it's really important that actually, maybe the most important thing and the most impactful thing that we can all do is actually just sit with that question. Yep. Let that sit with each of us and think about really, truly, how, if you start from a place of money, you start from a place of commercial, everything, every decision you make after that, we talk about North Star metrics, right, in businesses. If you start from a place of kind of money, that means every element that comes out of that will be for extraction. And people will feel that, and people will know that, and people will not trust that. And it's really, really vital that when we think about this space, we're really challenging ourselves to reimagine, and also not offsetting that. And also just not be defensive. I think this happens a lot. Like I said, I've been in so many kind of DEI, diversity things in different parts of organizations, and the natural thing for all of us is to do that, but actually, it's okay to feel uncomfortable about all of these things. It's okay to say, today I was challenged on that, and I want to kind of work through that and take steps every day going forward. Because of course these things aren't going to happen overnight, but I think that is probably the crucial thing that we can be doing next.
I'd like to just get one last question in, because I know there's one that's waiting to be asked there. Let's try and take that.
Thanks very much for that answer, Megan. I thought it was great. And I also agree with the previous question. Thanks very much for the question. My question is in a way related, in that on this panel and on many other panels here at the festival, I hear diversity being talked about by academics, I hear it being talked about by startups, I hear it being talked about by not-for-profits. I don't see the major commercial media companies talking about it. And can we expect any significant change to happen until that happens?
I think you're right. When I've started asking this question about, depending on what part of diversity, if you're talking about workforce diversity, audience diversity from those indicators, there definitely hasn't been the top of the agenda. I've been asking this question about workforce diversity for World Press Trends for many years now. And when we do look at, I ask them, what are your priorities for the next year? Different products, different kinds of things. When we do that for World Press Trends, the diversity workforce indicator is often very low down the big list. When we look at companies that report profits, we see it in the top 5. So sometimes measuring the diversity things are very helpful, but I think that's an important question.
Anything else to add? Okay, I think we're kind of on time actually, but should we take this conversation outside, I think? But
I just want to say, I do think it's a really important point you're saying. I just feel like I'm not from a commercial organization, so I can't answer it, but I think it is a really key thing that I hope anyone who's here can take that away and kind of and hold those in another space?
They have diversity officers and diversity committees.
That's true. Well, thank you ever so much to our panelists, and thank you to all of you.